My name is Frank Snepp. I was brought up as a Southerner, very conservative. I went to Columbia School of International Affairs, Columbia College. I was part of the Southern establishment. I was expected to be true blue American, and my views of Vietnam were framed accordingly before I got there. I emphasize before I got there. If you'd asked me when I was in college and graduate school what Vietnam was all about, I would have said it was about stopping communism, stopping the dominoes from falling. I had no knowledge of Vietnam and really no interest in going there. In fact, I was eminently draftable when I was in the School of International Affairs in my last year at Columbia. And a professor who viewed me as bad cannon fodder, decided that he would find me a new career that would keep me out of Vietnam. He said, "How would you like to become a spy?" Well, I had never thought about that. But this was the era of James Bond, and it had suddenly occurred to me that it might be preferable to be chasing blondes and Blofeld around Monte Carlo than dodging bouncing Bettys in the Mekong Delta. And so I signed on. I went into the CIA as an analyst. No knowledge of Vietnam. My specialty was military affairs, NATO and what have you, and I was immediately assigned to a rather high-level analytical post involving NATO. And I'd studied military affairs at Columbia. And when I got into the agency, Henry Kissinger had just taken over in the White House as National Security Advisor to Nixon. And it was thought in the agency that it would be great to have a young man who was immersed in NATO affairs in an important analytical spot. And sure enough, I was a feather in their cap, at least so far as the agency was concerned. I was briefing people from the White House. I could echo Kissinger because I had read everything he had written on nuclear war and limited war when I was a graduate student. But a jokester in my office at the CIA decided that I was much too serious for my own good. And he signed me up for a Vietnam posting as a joke without telling me. The CIA station in Vietnam in 1969 was 1,200 strong. They were hurting for warm bodies, and boy, were they willing to take this one. I found myself suddenly confronted with a choice. Losing my career in the agency or volunteering to go to Vietnam, and I chose to go to Vietnam. I went through some paramilitary training, small arms training, what have you, at the farm, one of the agency's facilities. And in mid-1969, a Pan Am jet dropped down out of the clouds, almost straight into Saigon to avoid small arms fire. And there I was in the war zone. I was totally ill-equipped to be there. I didn't speak Vietnamese and barely comprehensible English. I knew nothing about nothing having to do with Vietnam. I had only this ideologue's view, good Southern boy's view of what it was all about.
How old were you about?
Probably 25. I was probably in my mid-20s, late 20s. I was married at the time, just gotten married, and my wife didn't know I was in the CIA. She thought I was in the State Department. And when she decamped to Hong Kong and I was in Saigon, she began working for a bar there called the Go Down, just to have fun. And she was a real pothead. She loved pot. And at one point, the CIA station chief in Saigon and the station chief in Hong Kong pulled me aside and said, "You know, your wife is an embarrassment. She's a security risk, and you're going to have to choose between her and the agency." And being a good patriot, my marriage, I allowed my marriage to sort of dwindle away. It was the best thing that ever happened to my first former wife, because I was become a fanatic on the war in Vietnam. Because this is what happened. When I got there, again, knowing very next to nothing about Vietnam, I had one talent which was applicable. I had been trained as a journalist. In fact, that's what I thought my career would be, and I knew how to write fast and somewhat comprehensibly. And the agency liked that. And so I was assigned, stupid as I was, ignorant as I was of Vietnam, to a very special unit in the CIA station. This unit had been created in 1964 to produce on-the-spot analyses based on all-source intelligence for the ambassador, for the station chief, and for their dispatches to Washington. In other words, it was a little think tank on the spot that was to service the needs of the highest-ranking American officials in Vietnam. And because it had this purpose, those of us, the few of us who were part of this little group, were cleared for all-source substantive intelligence. That means that we read just about everything the intelligence agency of the United States collected on Vietnam, from just about all sources. That didn't mean that I was up to date on operational issues, like what spy was planted where, but I was responsible for analyzing what those spies gave us, and in time to interrogating those spies, prisoners, and other sources. But I was in the catbird seat. Now I want to pause and talk to you about this a little bit and what it meant morally. What it meant morally is that I knew much more than was good for anybody. I suffered from the curse of knowing too much. And that imposed a moral obligation on me that I was really too young to bear. It meant that knowing the truth, I had to do something with it to save lives. And that became my mission. I had been in Vietnam only 3 weeks. And because of my own dumb choices, I wound up in one of the worst firefights I have ever seen in Vietnam. And I was involved in it without any weaponry because I'd left my weapons in my vehicle. It was a bloody experience. I wound up with blood on my hands from encounters very up close and personal. It was so shocking to me, it changed my personality and my outlook forever. And I came away from that and I thought, I missed some advance warning. Some intelligence should have told me this was going to happen. And from that point on, getting the intelligence and getting it to Washington where it could make a difference for the better became my moral mission in Vietnam. Never asked me whether the war was justified, whether it was moral, whatever. That didn't concern me. My morality was one thing: getting the truth out and getting it to Washington. And every American casualty in Vietnam struck me as my own intelligence failure. It meant that I had failed to do something to gather some information that might have saved that life. Now you may say how melodramatic and how over the top. Vietnam did that to you. It tended to focus your energies and attention and your thoughts in ways that you never thought possible. So right from the beginning, because of that experience, that bloodbath I experienced 3 weeks into my first Vietnam tour, I became a man with a mission. getting at the truth. And my intelligence job was perfect for me. Because here I was in this unit whose purpose was getting at all the truth, digesting all the information, making use of it to save lives. This little unit, there were about 5 of us, focused on communist activities in Laos. My specialty was North Vietnam, right out of the box. The Viet Cong was my specialty. There was another person in my little group who concentrated on what was going on in Cambodia. That's what the CIA station did in Vietnam at that time. It covered the waterfront because we couldn't put people on the ground in Cambodia on sort of a permanent basis. So all of that thinking, all of that intelligence went through the CIA station in Saigon, and I was in the middle of it. And because I could write fast, I began to assume more and more importance to my superiors. I began writing the strategic analyses for the station chief, the Ambassador Bunker's own strategic analyses. I became a major briefer, and most important to me, I became an interrogator. Because if you were a guy in the field, if you were a case officer, you were not cleared for all source intelligence, because if you were captured, you had that much to surrender to the enemy. So what would happen is if a guy in the field, a CIA guy, a military guy, captured a highly placed enemy agent, source, general, you name it, they didn't have the knowledge. Not because they weren't smart, they just weren't cleared for their own safety. They didn't have the knowledge of the secrets to interrogate, get the most from the source, and we were brought in from my little unit to assist in the interrogation. And so from the very beginning, I was all over Vietnam. I would be brought in to help target PRU strikes, Phoenix operations designed to eliminate the enemy. I would go in and brief the special operations guys in the field who were leading the PRU teams to go in and kill the enemy. The problem with this operation was that the intelligence that I brought in often was imperfect, so often the targeting was imperfect and the wrong people were killed. I learned that very quickly, and I felt that was blood on my hands, and I just became fanatical about clearing beforehand any information I could get hold of. At one point, I confronted William Colby, who was in charge of pacification operations in Vietnam when I arrived. William Colby was one of the most famous spies in the CIA. He eventually became director. He and my father had been classmates at Columbia Law School, so he knew me well. In fact, Colby might have been my godfather, my father told me, had not World War II intruded. So here was Frank Snepp. I was in this incredible spot, access to all important intelligence, and I also was on a recognizable basis with top-ranking CIA officials and other people. And at one point, I had an opportunity, I think it was a year or so into my tour, first tour, to confront Colby about the Phoenix program, the kill program that we were running, which I was discussing. I serviced with the intelligence. I said to Colby, you know, the projection is that we've killed 20,000 of the Viet Cong in the past 2 years. That's the estimate that you're pushing on Congress, that you're preaching to Congress, to say that the Phoenix program is being successful. But I said, our figures also show there has been no 20,000 person diminution of the Viet Cong infrastructure, which means whoever we're killing, they're not Viet Cong. And he said, very interesting. And that was it. And that shocked me. And I have to tell you that it shocked me to my core. That experience was shocking to me, because here I was devoting all my energies to trying to get to the truth. And the truth was that the Phoenix program wasn't working But Bill Colby wasn't going to key on that. It was not politically expedient. One of the first lessons, sobering lessons I had in Vietnam. We were killing often the wrong people. And again, what did this do to me? It made me all the more determined to get at the truth and get it to Washington, to make sure that every fact I gathered made a difference, because I thought that was the only way to stop the killing. Again, that was my mantra. So, in time, because of my activities in this unit, my access to all source intelligence and what have you, my responsibilities expanded, and I was in the highlands. I would go in to brief South Vietnamese generals. I was detailed to the South Vietnamese police, to the special branch, which was a CI creation inside the National Police. And my job was to help them target their efforts against the Viet Cong. And I would go in and brief them. I would assist in drawing up hit lists and what have you. But I couldn't tell them all the truth, because there was great suspicion on the part of the CIA that the Viet Cong had penetrated the South Vietnamese police. In fact, one of the terrible things that we learned was that probably the Viet Cong had implanted inside government operations and bureaus, the police, the military, what have you, the South Vietnamese agencies, up to 3,000 spies by 1970. That meant the South Vietnamese government, the people I was working with, my friends, well, those agencies were like Swiss cheese. The enemy was everywhere. And so here I was, basically partnering with people I could not level with. My South Vietnamese counterparts in the police and in the South Vietnamese military were suspect. And so I was in this curious situation. It was just a crazy recipe for paranoia, where I couldn't help to the nth degree the people I was there to help. And by the way, not exclusive to me. This was true of all Americans there. A dirty little secret was that the enemy had so infiltrated our allies that we couldn't trust them with the information and intelligence they needed to save themselves. Well, you may say, Frank, surely you reported that to your superiors, that spies were everywhere. No, because something else began to become apparent to me during my first tour in Vietnam. There were some truths that nobody in Washington wanted to hear. One truth was that the South Vietnamese were infiltrated by the enemy and therefore unreliable. A second truth was that corruption was rampant in the country. Not a little bit, it was rampant. Let me just give an example. There was a phenomenon in Vietnam known as the ghost soldier syndrome, okay? That described a situation where South Vietnamese units were believed to have a certain number of people in them, a certain number of soldiers. But the commanders of those units overreported the manpower levels they commanded, because that meant that they could collect more money for that unit that they could pocket themselves. Because if you say you have, say, 15,000 men in a particular unit, and it's only half of that, the salaries directed at those missing people, you can put in your pocket. Well, that was the ghost soldier syndrome. And what that meant was, we never knew the exact size of friendly forces. What? We're in Vietnam, we have allies, and we can't even be sure of the head count. And that means, folks, that you can't be sure how much aid they need. Because if you don't know how many heads you have to put helmets on, You can't order up with any certainty the right number of helmets, and on and on and on. What that meant was one of the most important elements of our war-making effort, assumptions about our friends, were all vaporous. We couldn't be sure there were this many South Vietnamese available for combat, that they were reliable. And why not? Wait a minute, Frank. Couldn't you just go in and say to your counterpart, how many people do you have? Is there corruption in the ranks? You couldn't do that because something else that happened in Vietnam. We called it the buddy syndrome. If you're operating with a South Vietnamese captain, a South Vietnamese police officer, and he's a bad dude, he's doing something naughty, he's stealing money, he's pilfering the supplies, do you report him? Or if you do, he'll stop being your buddy. And so, throughout the American pacification establishment in Vietnam, the U.S. military, there was a reluctance to report on the weaknesses of our allies, lest our counterparts stop cooperating with us. You see this circular logic? And so, not only did we refuse to report on corruption, because we had to preserve our rapport with the South Vietnamese, because they were so suspect, not because they weren't brave, and I'll come back to that in a minute, but because the enemy had so penetrated their ranks, we couldn't share with them the intelligence they needed to survive. You talk about crazy think. That's what happens to you. And that's what happened to me. I didn't know who to trust. I didn't know whether I could trust anyone. The people I was closest to in the South Vietnamese military and police, I had always to double think about, well, is he leaking something to the enemy? And so, what does that do to a young man in his late 20s? It means that he is alone. In the U.S. military, your average GI is taught to bond with his fellows, okay? That's why soldiers will die for their comrades, because they are so bonded. It's the foxhole syndrome. You think as a unit if you're a soldier. That's what happened in Vietnam. That's why American soldiers were so effective against impossible odds oftentimes, because they all knew they would never leave anybody on the battlefield, not one of their buddies, because they were all part of a unit. A spy, somebody in my situation, no, different. You are alone. You operate alone. You trust no one. And boy, the solitude is astounding. This attitude destroyed my first marriage. The paranoia I developed in Vietnam, I carried with me on R&R to Hong Kong. And I didn't tell my wife I was in the agency. I didn't tell her what I was experiencing. I didn't tell her that 3 weeks into my first tour, I'd been in a terrible situation, a firefight, and I had been involved in lethal violence. I didn't tell her that. And imagine what that does to a marriage. Imagine that your partner doesn't know what you're doing. Your partner is not sharing with you your innermost thoughts, your paranoia, your guilt. Your guilt. None of it. And so the marriage quickly collapsed. And she was a wonderful woman. But there's no way that relationships can survive that kind of indiscretion. And I don't mean that in the sexual way. I mean you're just not leveling with your partner. And so that's what Vietnam did to my personal relationships. I had none that I trusted. None. I was a rip-roaring spy. I was a young James Bond. I had lots of companions. Lots of women I knew in Vietnam. But not many could I dare allow myself to become close to. You can't do it because you can't tell them anything meaningful about yourself, and you have to keep reckoning with the possibility that they're working for the enemy. That they're working for the enemy. What in the world does that do to your head? It screws you up big time. And boy, 1 year into my tour, first tour, that's where I was. But it also freed me up from emotional encumbrances that might have gotten in the way of the performance of my professional duties. I became the Lone Ranger with information in my holster. And I had no one I was close to. I was the kind of young man that father figures adopt. I was put together pretty good, presentable. I bought a whole bunch of blue shirts on one R&R visit to Hong Kong. I had a blue shirt for every occasion. I dressed spiffily, even for a war zone. And the older guys, the ambassador, his deputies, various CIA station chiefs, all came to view me as a kind of trustworthy younger protege. Ambassador Graham Martin, who was the last ambassador to Vietnam, came to view me as a surrogate son. His own son had been killed in combat in 1965 in Vietnam. I dated Martin's daughter, the ambassador's daughter, and so I was part of his tight-knit family, totally trusted. That's how my career advanced, because older would-be mentors mentored me and viewed me as the good soldier's swag. I'd do anything they asked. I would never betray them. The crazy thing happens, and it happened in the latter part of my last tour in Vietnam. The station chief at the time began to use me as a spy to determine what the ambassador was doing, because I was so close to the ambassador. And the ambassador used me as a spy to determine what the station chief was doing. It was a cat and mouse game. 2 cats, 1 mouse. I was it. It gave me incredible power. It gave me incredible access. But it also conditioned the way I behaved. I had all this truth. I did analytical stuff up the gazoo. I didn't dare at certain points tell my mentors what they didn't want to hear, because that could impair my status. And this is the way I rationalized it. I'm committed to telling the truth. That's my mantra. That's my moral posture. But I also came to think that, well, you play along to get along. Maybe you shave the truth today so that you can develop credit with your mentor, the ambassador, the station chief. You can accumulate credit so that when tomorrow comes, you can really do some good, because you'll have all of this power, this access, and you can use it for the good. The problem is, in places like Vietnam, and certainly for me in Vietnam, tomorrow never came. Because oftentimes I was holding back. I was being too polite to my mentors and my immediate superiors in the CIA and the ambassador's office, to be honest with them. And so I don't want to use the you, the impersonal you, I became compromised at the same time I was dedicating myself to getting at the truth so the truth would make us free. It was an astounding experience. Well,